Is there a book that you remember as being the first book you ever read? I have a very clear memory of the first chapter book I ever read as a child. And today's book bite is all about this wonderful, silly little woman that is the star of this book and this series. So join me for Book Bites. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Book Bites with the Booklady. I am Gretchen Shepherd, retired librarian, school librarian, and elementary school teacher, and a lover of children's literature. Yes, and that's what Book Bites is all about, celebrating wonderful books that are designed for children, but really can bring so much to our lives as an adult also. Today, I have a very special book in my heart. I was one of those lucky children who I don't remember learning to read. I just know that I read. And I was fortunate enough to be able to read full out chapter books by the time I was 5. Probably has something to do with I'm the youngest of 4 girls, and I bugged my sisters constantly and my mother, and they kept showing me what it was and handing me books to keep me busy, or the Sunday funnies, or this or that. But my mother always said that it was rather difficult to find appropriate literature for a 5-year-old who could read a chapter book, a simple chapter book, but who could read. She took me to the library. She volunteered at the public library, and the librarians would literally sit me down in the middle of a section and pile books around me and let me just go at it. Well, my mom went to go repair books. Well, the first book that I vividly remember reading cover to cover was Mrs. Pigglewiggle by Betty MacDonald. Now, Mrs. Pigglewiggle is something else, and the cures that she has, oh my gosh, if you remember them, if you've ever heard them, they're hilarious. They became the bane of my mother's existence because I would say, I'll do it because I want to and not because you tell me to, which was one of the answer or backer cure. But where did all that come from, and how did it start? It started with this amazingly interesting, fun little character named Mrs. Pigglewiggle that Betty MacDonald managed to describe so delightfully. And let me tell you a little bit about Betty. Now, Betty MacDonald was associated with the Pacific Northwest, which is where I'm located. She was born in Boulder, Colorado in 1908. She wrote a book called The Egg and I, and then the children's series of Mrs. Pigglewiggle. But she moved to the Northwest and lived on Seattle's Capitol Hill when her family moved there in 1918, and all kinds of areas. And then when she was married, she settled in the Port Townsend area near Chimacum. It was fascinating because she was one of the more well-known authors, and she was from the Pacific Northwest, which made her kind of a local hero. It was very fortunate for me because her books were something that I absorbed and loved and read constantly. In fact, I read this particular book, to every year of new students that I had for my entire teaching career. For all 35 years, this book was read aloud to a class of kindergartners or first graders or second graders or third graders, whatever I had that year. And then when I was the librarian, I read it to the younger kids. They loved it. Absolutely loved it. It made them laugh. Now, one of the lessons I had them do was to try to listen carefully and see if they could then draw Mrs. Pigglewiggle's house once that was described. So maybe you can get a little sense of the imagination of what the visualization of this whole story was about as I bring to you the story of Mrs. Pigglewiggle. Mrs. Pigglewiggle herself. I expect I might as well begin by telling you all about Mrs. Pigglewiggle so that whenever I mention her name, which I do very often in this book, you will not interrupt and ask, "Who is Mrs. Pigglewiggle? What does she look like? How big is she? How old is she? What color is her hair? Is her hair long? Does she wear high heels? Does she have any children? Is there a Mr. Pigglewiggle?" Now, Mrs. Pigglewiggle lives here in our town. She is very small and has a hump on her back. When children ask her about the hump, she says, "Oh, that's a big lump of magic. Sometimes it turns me into a witch, other times into a dwarf or a fairy, and on special occasion, it makes me into a queen." The children are all very envious of the hump because, besides being magic, it is such a convenient fastening place for wings. Mrs. Pigglewiggle has brown, sparkly eyes and brown hair, which she keeps very long, almost to her knees, so that children can comb it. She usually wears it on top of her head in a knot, unless someone has been combing it. And then she has braids or long wet curls or long hair just hanging and with a jeweled crown or flowers on top. One day I saw her digging in her garden wearing the jeweled crown and with her hair billowing down her back. She waved gaily and said, "I promised Betsy," Betsy is one of her children friends, "that I would not touch this hair until she came home from school." And she went on with her digging. Mrs. Pigglewiggle's skin is a goldy brown, and she has a warm, spicy sugar cookie smell that is very comforting to children who are sad about something. Her clothes are all brown and never look crisp and pressed because they are used for dress-up. She wears felt hats, which the children poke and twist into witches' and pirates' hats, and she does not mind at all. Sunday mornings, she takes one of the hats off the closet shelf, gives it a few thumps, pulls it firmly down fore and aft, and wears it to church. She wears very high heels all the time and is glad to let the little girls borrow her shoes. Mrs. Pigglewiggle has no family at all. She says that her husband, Mr. Pigglewiggle, was a pirate, and after he had buried all of his treasure in the backyard, he died. She just has herself and Wag, her dog, and Lightfoot, her cat. The most remarkable thing about Mrs. Pigglewiggle is her house, which is upside down. It is a little brown house, and sitting there in its tangly garden, it looks like a small brown puppy lying on its back with its feet in the air. Mrs. Pigglewiggle says that when she was a little girl, she used to lie in bed and gaze up at the ceiling and wonder what it would be like if the house were upside down. And so, when she grew up and built her own house, she had it built upside down just to see. Now, the bathroom, the kitchen, and the staircase are right side up. They are more convenient that way. You can easily see that you could not cook on an upside-down stove or wash dishes in an upside-down sink or walk up upside-down stairs. In the living room of her house is a large chandelier, and instead of being on the ceiling, it's on the floor. Of course, it really is on the ceiling, but the ceiling is the floor, and so it is on the floor. And the children turn on the lights and then squat around it, pretending it is a campfire. Mrs. Pigglewiggle says that her chandelier is the only one in town that is put to any real use. Her bedrooms all have slidey boards in them because if you will look up at your attic ceiling, you will see that it has a slanty ceiling. When turned upside down, makes a fine slidey board. Also, all the wall lights are very close to the floor and handy for small children. For the first 5 or 10 years after the house was built, Mrs. Pigglewiggle climbed in and out of her rooms over the high doorways. But now she has little steps, which are just the thing to practice jumping. She gives the children chalk so they can mark on the rug how far they jump. Nobody knows how old Mrs. Pigglewiggle is. She says she doesn't know herself. She says, "What difference does it make how old I am when I shall never grow any bigger?" Mrs. Pigglewiggle's dog, Wag, has puppies every once in a while, and so she keeps a long list of names of children who want them on the blackboard in her kitchen. For Lightfoot, the cat's kittens, she has a long waiting list on the blackboard in the dining room. Mrs. Pigglewiggle's backyard is full of big holes where small boys dig for Mr. Pigglewiggle's buried treasure, and her front yard is full of flowers, which the little girls pick, jam into vases, and place about her living room or carry to their teachers. Every child in town is a friend of Mrs. Pigglewiggle's, but she knows very few of their parents. She says grown-ups make her nervous. For the first year after she built her house, Mrs. Pigglewiggle lived there all by herself, except for Wag and Lightfoot, and she was very lonely. Then one dark and rainy afternoon, when she was baking sugar cookies and thinking how much fun it would be if she knew someone besides Wag and Lightfoot to invite for tea, she happened to look out her window, and there, coming up the street in the pouring rain, dragging a big suitcase and bawling, was a little girl. Mrs. Pigglewiggle wiped the flour off her hands and hurried right out into the rain and invited the little girl in for tea. Well, you can probably hear all kinds of things thinking like, oh my gosh, going into a stranger's house for tea, this and that. Yes, this was written, oh my gosh, I can't remember when Mrs. Pigglewiggle was written. There we go. Mrs. Pigglewiggle was written in 1947. You can guess. Things were a little different. So the stories have not been updated for the current generation, but boy, do they spark some wonderful conversations and wonderful imagination. So, were you able to draw Mrs. Pigglewiggle's upside down house? That was one of my favorite art projects to do with kids, and we would display them all over, and they loved doing it. Mrs. Pigglewiggle has always been a favorite of mine. I read it to my niece and got a call from my sister one time when my niece had responded to my sister with, "I'll do it because I want to and not because you tell me to." My sister wasn't real pleased with that time, but still, the memories that Mrs. Pigglewiggle brought to us, and the joy and the laughter and the hilarity of all her cures, is a book that makes it a wonderful, humorous classic. It's one that I really recommend that you sit down and share with someone you care for, even if it's just with yourself. It's a delightful book. Mrs. Pigglewiggle is a delightful character. And the descriptions that Betty McDonald does in that book are just so fun. I really recommend the very first book, the Mrs. Pigglewiggle. There's several others, The Farm, Her Magic, all these kind of things, but my favorite really is her very first book, Mrs. Pigglewiggle by Betty McDonald. That's my book bites with the Booklady for Nodpod Pomo on day 6. Thank you all for joining me. If you enjoy this content, there's more over on YouTube on my channel on Images by Gretchen, where I share some picture books. But for now, for this podcast, that's it for today. So until next time, keep looking for the beauty hidden in plain sight. It's all around you, but the first place you'll find it is when you go look in the mirror. And I'll see you in the next episode.